strategy needs context. And if there is no context, a strategy may not be useful. For example, if I tell you a company whose strategy is that make the best chocolate in the world, right? That's not really useful strategy. Or if there's a company whose strategy is have more engaged people through my feed, that's also not a clear strategy because it does not talk about the context. It does not talk about what needs to happen. It does not talk about all the other things surrounding it. So I think my first learning about strategy and talking to about strategy to senior leaders, selling the strategy of my product has been that you need to start as a journey. You need to start by talking about what's the context, what's the current status. Then talk about what does success look like, and then talk about the actual strategy. And from there, having a measure of progress of how are you doing against your strategy is important. The roadmap may or may not be so important in this framing, but I think what I've learned is really important in this framing is to take people through the story of how the strategy came into being, why that is the strategy, more than anything else. So I'll pause on this to see if anybody has something to ask, something to discuss, or I can go to the next slide. Cool. So maybe I can talk about the next thing. I think a strategy starts by talking about where we are today. And I think one of the key things I've learned over my career is you start by assuming that your audience, though it's very well-meaning, if you're presenting to the VP of your company, right, he or she wants to know everything, but then they don't have the time to know everything. And you also don't have the time to tell them about everything you know. So one of the key things I've done mistakes in the past is when I've assumed that the person I'm presenting to knows the problem very well, or when I'm talking about specific things about the solution or the problem facing, they really know. If I tell my VP, hey, my product onboarding sucks, I'm assuming he or she knows what the onboarding flow is, how bad is it, how competition does it. But what I've learned over my past, that's making too much of an assumption. Senior leaders are usually very busy people. So they may not understand a lot about your product. They may not understand a lot about your context. So the most important thing is to synthesize it for them. Talking about the trends, talking about the status today, and really clearly articulating the problems. And I kind of put some example up from different companies where I saw that they were doing a good job talking about where we are today. The first one is LinkedIn, where they spoke about the product problem of selection, of selecting service providers, selecting employees, reaching professionals. And that kind of gives you a good set of the current state and where they want to be. Uber also kind of did a very good slide around where they saw the cab market when they launched about 12 years back. It was inefficient. There was a lot of problems around how the entire customer experience taken place. Once you've set the context really well, I think the audience start becoming sold on the journey. And then you can slowly start taking them onto the journey of where you want to be. Questions, thoughts, any personal experiences you want to share?
I have a question actually.
Yeah.
If you do it not the right way, what kind of problems have you had in your career? So I don't know, like examples from meetings when the leadership or whoever you are talking to, um, what kind of what kind of questions they start asking. So why is it important?
Yeah. I think when I've tried to present a strategy without talking about where we are today, right, what has clearly not landed is where do we want to go? So in the past, I've managed an onboarding, right? one of the uh, one of the problems in onboarding we're trying to solve is education. How do we educate our vendors so that they end up with success later? Initially, we started pitching saying, hey, we want our vendors to be educated. And that strategy clearly was not landing. But then what we started doing was we did a bunch of surveys. We got some example personas and then started saying, okay, if let us look at a typical vendor. This is a typical vendor. And do we really think this vendor can succeed on the platform? And that really changed the narrative because then people started associating with those personas and associating with the current state much better.
All right, thank you.
Any other questions on this slide, or I can then go to the next one? Okay, cool. I think the next thing is, as we said, where we are today. The second thing is, where do we want to be? And I think there's a very different ways of talking about where do we want to be. And this is just one way, which is success statements. And this is a very typical way from a product perspective. We define our end state or our end goal. I think what I have on the slide is a bunch of examples of success statements, right? And they go from bad to good. For example, increasing market share by 10% may be a good success statement from an organization perspective. But really, as a product manager, you're trying to solve a particular product problem, right? It's solving a particular user problem. So there, increasing market share by 10% does not really give you a lot of hints or a lot of direction of where you want to go. The same sense, be the largest player in the market is again not a good success statement because it does not really talk about the user problems you were trying to solve. It does not really talk to you about what you want to do as a product. Now, I think what I'm hinting at here is there might be business success statements and there might be product success statements. Sometimes they're very different. And as product managers, when we're starting to set product strategies, it's important to anchor on the product success statements. So let me give some more examples. Making vendor onboarding fast is a good product success statements because it talks about what is the kind of experience you want to do from a product perspective. And you could also link it back to the end business results it does. Now, the statement above that, reduce vendor onboarding time by 50%. Does not, at least from a strategy perspective, is not a very good success statement because it just takes a very narrow metric and tries to measure how much you want to improve. Uh, uh, Now, reduce vendor onboarding time by 50%. Does that mean that if you've reduced it by 40%, you've not done a good job in the product? Or if you've reduced it by 50%, you want to go after 50% in the next half? So in that sense, I think uh, focusing on the outcomes you want to drive is super important when we're setting up success statements. And I think that's been one of my learnings is how do you write the right kind of outcomes you want to do from a product success perspective. Second thing which we fall against sometimes is we focus on very prescriptive success statements. So if a product strategy says launch a backend system to translate, right? It's not really a strategy. It's just a plan, right? Because you've prescribed a particular path to get there. And it does not leave you enough opportunity or flexibility to find out what's the best way of solving the problem. Now compare that to a statement to say, allow customers across Europe to use your service. So that kind of talks about a good place where you want to be, because then you can talk about your current state. Today, people in Netherlands can use my service. In the future, I want to allow customers across US, EU to use my service. So that kind of one paints a very good picture from where you want to go to where you want to be. And that also gives you enough freedom of execution of how do you want to reach the success statement. And I can go on and on about success statements and how they matter and why they matter. But I'd again love to get some discussion going and get people's thoughts on this. Mm.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if you take you're clearly making a case for the product outcomes, what value should the product be? You also mentioned the more, let's say, operational, organizational, business KPI like statements.
Yeah.
Do you see a hierarchy between the two? Does one come before the other? Is one more important than another? How do you view that?
So I personally feel, and this is my personal thing, that any metric is actually a proxy. So you're trying to measure something, you're trying to achieve something, an outcome, and a metric is a way of measuring that. Sometimes it's a very good proxy, sometimes it's not such a good proxy. So in that sense, when we're really thinking strategically, I would always love to anchor it against outcomes. Now, and because that's what you're trying to achieve. Now, in that sense, I'd say that metrics are super valuable. Metrics are valuable because they give you a progress. They tell you that whether we're making progress or not, how much progress are we making. But uh, 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 at the end of the day, they're just a success. They're just a proxy. For example, let's take, and it's a very bad example, like uh, uh, daily active users, right? Mm. If you had daily active users as your outcome, right? Is it that you're trying to do daily active users, or is it you're trying to do happy customers or engage customers? And daily active users is a way of measuring that. And that's just a KPI, because there might be multiple companies whose objective will be to happy users, right? And people will measure daily active users very, very differently. Somebody will say average across 7 days. Somebody would say that valuable actions done. So in that sense, all those KPIs are second level outcomes. They do not really dictate your product strategy.
Clear. Thanks.
Any other questions, comments, or or
If just one comment, I think it's a good, the best outcomes define a great value for both the user and making it also worthwhile for the organization, right?
yeah, yeah. Well, thanks for teeing that up. I think it goes back to one of the key things, right? And let's say that you're in a marketplace setting. A good success statement would actually mean a three-way thing. It should add value for the user, it should add value for the seller, and it should add value for the marketplace. So if you're at Amazon, you're trying to sell, right? You want the buyer to be happy, you want the seller to be happy, and you want Amazon to have good outcomes of that. So in that sense, a good success statement may have multiple flavors to it. And for example, when we talk in Facebook, we sometimes talk about what's the people outcome we're trying to drive, what's the business outcome we're trying to drive, and say what's the Facebook outcomes we're trying to drive. And some of them may be very, very different to each other. And for example, let's take ads, and one of the most controversial things. The ads outcomes, one of the things you may want to drive as an advertising product manager is you want users to see more relevant ads. What you want to drive as a business, from a business side, is you want your advertisers to get more outcomes from your ads. The outcomes can be more site visits, the outcome can be more conversions. As a marketplace for ads, you may want your advertisers to be more active and spend more money. Now, these are very, very different outcome statements. And when you're setting a strategy, we will need to pick of which of the outcome statements you want to focus more on. Whether it's trying to be more relevant to users, whether it's trying to be getting more money for businesses, or whether it's driving more outcomes. In the ideal state, you might be able to do all of these three objectives, but in the real life practical scenario, you might need to pick and choose. And I think that's where strategy starts becoming very real and practical, when these hard choices need to be made, because that's what makes for a very effective strategy. And now different companies have different ways of putting success statements. I don't know how many of you are familiar with the Amazon press release, but Amazon press release is a concept which Amazon has where uh, before you launch a product, you kind of write a one pager and assuming that what would the press release look like when you launch the product. So you are looking future forward saying that, okay, 1 year from now, I launch the product. How was this success look like? And you try to talk about success from what is the what is the customer problem you're solving, what is the kind of success customers, happy customers you'll see, having quotes around that. To me, this is another way of framing a success statement, because ultimately what you're doing with this press release is talking about what the end outcomes you want to achieve. And press release is just a form of doing that. You can also do that with slides. You can also do that with a Google Sheet. I think the template does not matter. I think what matters is if having the right way of defining the success statements and having the right success statements. For example, if you see the Amazon Web Services success statement, it just speaks about a simple storage service that offers highly scalable, reliable, low latency data storage at a low cost. And this is a good success statement. I'd say this is a good success statement because what does it allow you to do from a product strategy perspective? It allows you to talk about what is simple and how do you make it simple, right? It talks about what is scalable. It talks about what is reliable and what talk about low costs. So from a product strategy perspective, if you are a team working on, say, Amazon Web Services, you can start talking about this as the end outcome for web services, and then pick your team and say, which part of these success statements will you drive? For example, if you were working on the infra part of it, right, you might want to say, hey, as my infrastructure team, my key thing is the outcomes I want to drive is highly scalable and reliable. Now, and that's the outcome you want to drive from a product strategy perspective if you are the infrastructure team. Let's say that you are working on the Amazon Web Services, right, and focusing on seller onboarding, software onboarding. So you might want to talk about your success statement saying, offer software developers a simple service which they can use, and then build your product strategy around that outcome statement. So in that sense, if the company or if the bigger product you have has a good outcome statement, you can slowly start building your success statements from that as a ladder tree. And, and the other thing with that kind of helps is it helps anchor your strategy to the company strategy. Because let's say if a team today in Amazon comes and says, hey, you know what? I can reduce the cost of S3 storage. And that's my product outcome I want to do, right? Uh, Versus a strategy team comes and says, you know what? I want to make S3 storage available across all devices. Guess which team would you have more strategic alignment? The one which is low cost really has an outcome strategy, product strategy statements, which aligns to the broader vision and framing. So in that sense, getting alignment there and driving that outcome will be much easier for the team who's trying to work on cost. So as you're thinking about your product and your company, think of the broad outcome statements the company has. Think of the success statements you're trying to frame for your product and see how they link together. Because this is, to me, one of the critical parts of strategy is how your strategy is actually working in tune with the company's strategy or the broader product strategy. Because if you don't do that, that is going to be a recipe for disaster. Because if your success statements are very, very different from what your company's success statements are, either people won't buy your strategy, or two, getting funding for a team, which is something we all want to do, to grow the team, grow the area will be difficult. Or three, in times you maybe need to justify why your team exists. And that is a situation nobody of us wants to be in. So hence, my focus is a lot on in the strategy, focusing on the success statements we want to achieve and seeing how we tie that back to what our company goals are, what our broader vision are. Again, I've spoken for a long time, so I'll pause to see if there are any thoughts, if there are any discussions here.
Just to make sure, a technical question. Can people unmute themselves? If you cannot, I've heard one feedback that people cannot unmute themselves.
Yes, they
if you have oh, you can now. Okay, thanks.
Yeah. So cool. Are there any questions, or I move on to the next part of it? Cool. If there are no questions, I want to go on the next thing. Sorry, did I hear someone?
Yeah, I see that some people have some troubles with unmuting. So if you have troubles with unmuting, please put your question in the chat so that we can discuss it.
Yeah. Cool. So I'll pause to see if there's some question or not for a couple of seconds. And if you can just say you had a question, we can just discuss. Yeah.
I have a general question, and that's like the case I'm looking at now, is that how would you facilitate the creation of company like strategic statement or something? Because in a product organization it's easier, but then when you go to a global scale, and I'm sure you can say that you would miss it if you don't have that kind of thing from company.
Yeah. I think there are a bunch of different frameworks which can be used. I think one of the frameworks which you can use is every company has some sort of like, let's say there are two kinds of company, right? There's a company who has a published vision statement or a published goals. So in that sense, you can try and articulate statements which meet that goals. For example, a company might say that, hey, we want to grow in markets in EMEA around the SMB segments, right? And they might have some goals around how they want to grow. So one option is trying to articulate those goals in success statements and then linking your success statements to that. So that might be one strategy. The other strategy is you could have kind of a map where you talk about your success statements. Let's take one here, like vendor onboarding fast, and then show how it maps up to the company goal. So if the company goal is to have, say, 10,000 vendors on board, you can say my outcome statement is vendor onboarding fast. Why? Because it directly ties up to the 10,000 vendors. Does that answer your question or not?
Yeah, at least partially. Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. So I have a question from Lynn. Lynn, if you're on the call, do you want to unmute and maybe chat about it, or I can read it out?
Oh, I can unmute now. Yes. Yeah, so I had a question. So for instance, you have a product that is in the end used by consumers, like normal people, but the consumers are not basically the buyers of that product. So companies buy that product, and the end users will use it via that other company. So you can have like a good strategy that says, well, I want to have like the end users that use this, like to make their lives better. But how would you then define the strategy towards the business that is actually buying this product?
Yeah.
Like that has to invest in it, that in order to offer it to their end users. Because you can make their clients' life better, but they still need to see that other business value in it.
So I think here is where in my past I've worked with a product marketing manager, if you have somebody, because this is a very good example of where a good value proposition or a go-to-market will help. Because essentially your product strategy, right? And let's take building features. Your features we are going to build for the end users may not change, right? But we still need to find a way that we can convince businesses why they need to buy this product. And I think it's here where having a partnership with a product marketing person helps, because then you can start building value propositions around the features so that they can go to market. I think one of the key things here, perhaps also good to talk about, is ultimately, I think we sometimes end up mixing business strategy and product strategy, right? And or sales strategy and a product strategy. I think overall, from a strategic perspective, if the goal is to make the end user lives better, because we know that matters and that will add to more value for businesses, right? The product roadmap and the features you develop need to be geared towards that. And you might need to have a separate product marketing roadmap, which talks about the value proposition for end businesses, and then sell that concept to them. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. I have a question on Rolf first. Rolf, you want to go? Yeah. Okay, so the question I have from Rolf is that the senior management at my company tends to wait on the product team to do market research, to deliver product strategy based on market research. Next, company success statements are set and company strategy is set at a high level. Is it possible to do that first, or do I need a company strategy first? I'd say from my limited experience, you can do that, right? You can set a product strategy statement and then set a company strategy statement. And it depends upon how much the product led the company is. It also depends upon how aligned you think the management is to your mental model. If you understand your management senior leaders' mental models, if you think that you have a good read of them, you can definitely set a product strategy and then do a company strategy, because it's very likely that your product strategy will align with the company strategy. But on the other hand, if you're not sure how the leadership will think about company strategy, right, you doing market research and working on a product strategy, that might fall flat, because the leaders might think of something else and you might need to completely change your product roadmap and pivot your entire strategy. And that may not be the best use of your time. So I'd say that I don't know whether there's the right method of doing that, but I think you need to read your audience to see what will work better.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Cool. Any other questions, or I can talk about the next slide I have.
Just a short note from a time perspective. So we are now at 8:15, which is formally the end of our meeting. So if people need to go, they always need to go. However, I think we are having a great conversation here. So I would like to invite you to continue the story and hopefully also continue with people who want to stay.
Good. I think the other piece about strategy is, and this is my personal opinion, any strategy which just says one path is a bad strategy, because ultimately you're going towards a success statement, right, or outcome, whatever we want to call it. And ideally, there should be multiple paths towards it. And the good strategy is picking which path to choose. And you should be constantly asking yourself is, what are the other paths we could have chosen but haven't chosen? And what are the assumptions to taste? And let's take an example in the middle. I don't know how many people know about these two apps. This one is Tinder and one is Bumble. And to me, they make a very good reading of different strategies. Both of them, the end success statement is they want more matches. But I think the difference is Tinder, once you match, you can message. Bumble, only the female person can initiate the first message. Now, both of them are valid strategies to get to the end outcome, which is more matches, more engaging matches. But to me, it's a very, very good case study of how two different companies and apps have taken very, very different strategies. So that I think is a good one. The other example I have from is Amazon. And what I know from history is Today, Amazon, you can see third-party sellers, which are just sellers, plus Amazon selling items on the same page. What I know historically is this was a big strategic shift from Amazon. And if you look at, say, an eBay, this is not the case, right? Because eBay, every seller has their own page. The big strategic decision of Amazon was, do we allow third-party sellers to compete with Amazon? Because Amazon has built the product page with a lot of product information. And the strategic decision was that, should we allow third-party sellers to do that? From the past, what I know is there was a lot of debate about that. But at the end, Jeff Bezos took the strategic call as this is good for the customers. Hence, we should do that. And again, to me, that's a very uh, good discussion thing to think about, because now you're looking at multiple paths to get to the end success statement and then trying to pick what do you think would work for your project the best. Again, if at the end of the day, if you see there is only one path, right, I think you should ask yourself that, have I set my success statements right? Or am I thinking too solution focused rather than thinking of a strategic path? Or is there other paths I'm not even considering? Because sometimes it's just good to consider the paths. And one of the key things I've seen leadership challenge when you do strategies is, why this strategy? Why not something else? And if you've just thought of strategy A and just presented that, that question kind of catches people off guard. This has caught me off guard a number of times. But where you can go to leadership and say, you know what, we have 3 strategies here, and these are the pros and cons. And based on the pros and cons, our team and we feel the strategy A is the one we can pursue. I think what it allows people to know that you're open. You've looked at various strategies. 2, it allows people to choose, to think of the pros and cons and choose the right one. So in that sense, strategy to me is always about choices and talking about all those choices and then picking one at the end of the day. Questions, thoughts here?
And the choices should be mutually exclusive, or it's like, because the choice plus a small adjustment, is it another choice?
Yeah.
And what is the purpose? Is it like to give some kind of picture of having the consideration and get the buy-in for the one that you want to pursue, or you really want to consider several options?
I think it's the last. You really want to consider several options, right, at least, and then you will make a choice of what's the right choice to go, right path to go, right? And based on the time you have and based on the your leadership, it's sometimes important to take them on the journey, saying that, you know what, we thought about all those paths and we picked the path X because of these reasons. And that kind of solidifies your strategy, because then people look at you as a product manager who's thinking really strategically, evaluating all aspects, and then picking and prioritizing the right thing. And the other thing it offers is insurance. And I'll say that in a very, like, it's perhaps not the best way of thinking about it, but let's say you had 2 strategies and you picked the wrong one. If you go back after 3 months and say, you know what, we looked back and we feel that we made a wrong choice, right? It perhaps is a much easier sell than when you go after 3 months and say, hey, you know what, there's a new strategy we want to come up with as a team. And that narrative I've seen never lands, because the first question they get asked is, why did you not think of this in the first place? Versus it's much better to say that we thought of this in the first place, but did not choose it for some reason. And that, I think, allows a lot of flexibility in how we want to define a product strategy. Did I answer your question, Sultan?
Yes. I had this experience, and it always helps to have at least like 2 or 3 options. And it also helps to get buy-in indeed. It's like, but I haven't thought about this one, when you can come back and say, hey, we chose a wrong one, so just be humble and and just said that yes, we made a mistake.
Yeah. I think this goes to my slide, right, which is about tracking progress. And again, I think I know we're out of time, so if you're happy to leave, please go ahead. But I'm happy to stay back and chat, right? I think uh, uh, tracking progress, and this is a classic case we all suffer from. We've set a strategy, and then things are not moving right. So what happens? Do you think your execution is wrong, or do you think your strategy is wrong? And that's a dilemma we all face. I think, and this is where I think really strong product managers I've seen are able to disentangle the both. Like, for example, mm, the phone you see here is Iridium. It was the world's first satellite phone, right? Where you could go and make a call from everywhere, right? And the problem they're trying to solve is that how do we make sure everybody has access to the phone? People who had access to the phone really went well. I think where it went wrong was execution, because there the call rates were so high, most people could not have access to the phone. So in that sense, from strategic direction, they were thinking right. Versus, let's take the example of Kodak. Kodak decided to go after analog films when there was market which was showing digital was showing up. To me, this is like a classic product strategy problem, is where we've taken a wrong strategic choice. And they did not think and pivot fast enough. The last one I had was Orkut. I don't know whether how many of you were familiar with Orkut, but Orkut was one of our big social networks at one point of time. And like before Facebook, it was the big Facebook. I think what Orkut did was a lot of features of Orkut are today not even on Facebook. And Orkut had a huge number of people. But where I think Orkut's execution went wrong is that Orkut did not have verified people. So there was no real life identity behind somebody's Orkut identity, which meant that you had a bunch of fake profiles there. And the conversation started going haywire very, very soon with, uh, 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 with, with bad, wrong content being shared. And that kind of killed that social network. Why I'm kind of trying to give these examples is, on one side, perhaps there were operational metrics which Orkut could have seen, which said that the execution was not going right. Right. On the other hand, there were some fundamental assumptions about the market which Kodak made. And these were the assumptions of the market Kodak could have tested. Again, these are all in hindsight. And I think one thing I keep telling people, right, it, it is that as a product manager, you should always be asking yourself, am I solving the most impactful problem? And the moment you kind of stop asking yourself that question, it means you're falling into a zone of complacency. And it also means that your strategy might start backfiring. Because if you're constantly asking yourself that, am I solving the most important questions or problems, right, there is less of a chance that you fall into this loophole earlier. Yeah. Cool. So there was a question on Anna on the previous slide. Anna, are you there? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm here. You
Yeah.
kind of answered it already, but I was just curious about any specific frameworks or approaches, or maybe on the flip side, any pitfalls or like around sort of picking the right path for your product.
Mm, mm. I'd say that the pitfall I'd suggest is uh, uh, don't pick a path you're not confident on. Because if you don't have belief that's the right path, that will spread across the team, that will spread across the organization, and people will not be committed towards it. So,
Interesting.
so think of what you have a strong belief towards. And some of these paths you will not have data, right? And that's why they're hard problems. You won't have enough data to say what's the right path. But I think that goes down to your belief of saying why it's the right path, and being very transparent to people is, these are my assumptions. And this is something we need to test over time. Yeah. So I think the next question I have is from Divya. Divya, you want to ask a question?
Hi, yeah. I was wondering when you decide what the right metrics are, because if you want to start measuring if you're going in the right direction or if you have to pivot to something else, then when you're defining the success statement, is that the point where it impacts or it influences what your metrics are? Like, how do you, would that be the right stage to define, okay, these are the metrics I'm going to measure for this success statement?
So at least I think,
Thank you. Yeah.
yeah, I think the way I think about it is there are different levels of metrics. There's one is North Star metrics, right? Which is talks about where you want to go to, right? And then there are a bunch of operational metrics. So for example, let's take Orkut and I'll just hypothesize. One of the North Star metric could be that to have all of your friends on Orkut, right? That could be as all of your friends are active on Orkut, right? Now, having such a North Star statements creates a mental model and allows you to think how you want to go. But let's look back at the statements. Having all of your friends active at Orkut. There is no way in the world Orkut will know who all your friends in real life are. And that is something they can never measure, right? But so that cannot be a good product KPI. You can have multiple proxies around it. For example, you can have proxies around what percentage of a person's friends are active, right? That does not talk about the North Star, but is some way of measuring the North Star. So I'd say that when you're thinking about the success statements, think about your North Star metrics, right? But you may want to have more operational metrics, which you should set later in the day when you're starting to do roadmaps.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think this is kind of my last slide. And I'd say that what my learning has been that at, there are a bunch of myths, right? One of the first myths I realize is roadmap is a document for me and my team. At the end of the day, I realized that roadmap is not the document for me and my team. It's a document for me to communicate what I'm doing, for my team to communicate what they're doing. Because at the end of the day, most teams, right, will be small enough and there will be enough people who know what the team is doing. But this clearly is a way for you to outline to people what you're doing. So in that sense, right, I'd say that one of the key things I've learned about product roadmap is how simple can you make your product roadmap items to be. Is it at a level that only people within your team can understand? For example, improve uh, the scape system performance by 15% on axis ABC. Or is it something more broad, like improve the prediction of bad actors? So I think about this statement because one of them, when you share to outsiders, they can make sense. Or the other way you might want to do it, you might want to have different versions of the roadmap, one for sharing, one for an internal team. I think the second myth I've realized is everybody understands how my roadmap ties to my strategy. People don't. Like people maybe your leaders may look at your roadmap after 3 months, right? And they might have forgotten what your strategy was. So you need to constantly tie it back to strategy, use the same kind of phrasing, use the same kind of words, right? Use the same strategic pillars all through. The third myth is that our plan is great. And I think it goes back to the previous slide. I think as a PM, you should always be self-doubting of whether you're solving the right problem and the most impactful problem or not. And if it's not solving the most impactful problem, you should bubble that up, right? And what I've realized is no company wants to spend their resources and money employing people who are not working on the most impactful things. So in my past, at least I've seen that where I've bubbled up, say, you know what, I'm working on problem one, but I think problem two is more important. Either people have given me new information of why problem one is more important, or people have told me, hey, you know what, stop problem 2, go on to stop problem 1, go on to problem 2, because that's a more important thing to solve for the company. So I think constant doubting is a great thing. And the last myth I know is a busy roadmap means we're doing great work. I think some of the best roadmaps I've seen are short summaries. A roadmap is not really a task breakdown of the task that needs to be done. A roadmap is just the high level of features and solutions you're developing. And good teams and good focus teams have very sharp and short roadmaps, which they talk about 3 or 4 very, very impactful things they're doing rather than 50 small, small things. So that kind of was my set of very biased views on strategy. So I don't know if there are any questions left or not. Cool. If there are no questions left, thank you everybody for your time, and I hope to have the conversation. You can connect me with LinkedIn if you want to have some more conversations around this. Thank you.
Awesome. Cool. So thanks a lot, Roy, for that great talk and great conversation also with the whole audience.
Yes.
With that, we come to the end of our first virtual Amsterdam meetup. I hope you've enjoyed it and also gotten some valuable knowledge out of that. We're going to be hosting some more meetups in the near future, so be sure to keep an eye out on our social channels if you like this, so that you can join in the future. Obviously, we got the PMF in Zurich coming up, so we hope to see you there. And I want to close off with a big thank you, first to Roy and Arjan, of course, for their great talks. And second to my co-host Sultan and Anna for organizing today. So with that, let's close it off. Thanks a lot to everybody for joining, and see you soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.
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 Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.